I've spent the last hour Googling the name of my hometown. Nothing is there. All of the local schools, all the local restaurants, gone. Even my social media is kind of messed up. I can't find any of my friends online. I can't find anybody. I'm actually kind of freaking out about it. Has anybody ever experienced anything like this before? Don't believe me? Try yourself. Fullerton City High? Gone. Fullerton Middle? Gone. Fullerton Elementary School? Gone. Fullerton City College? Gone. That preschool behind the tire place and next to that McDonald's, which my mom took us to growing up? You get the idea. All gone. Thousands of people, dozens of places I can't find information for anywhere. It's like we disappeared. I can't even reach the cops. I wish that were the only problem. My family and I woke up this morning to a total blackout. Every single house on the block lost power. That does tend to happen out here in the valley, often enough that my older brother Mark rigged his computer to get a connection via satellite. The two of us are currently crouched beside the generator, desperately trying to get a handle on the past few hours. My parents are panicking. They won't say anything. They won't say why, but we have our suspicions. I saw something in the woods last night. Right before the power went out, when it was still dark outside, Mark woke me up and pulled me over to his bedside window. He pointed frantically into the trees behind our house. It was raining. The mist made it difficult for my eyes to adjust, but after a moment, something big darted towards the neighbor's back porch. A thick branch fell in its wake. Then somebody screamed. My parents rushed into the room right at that moment. I guess they had heard the commotion and freaked. Mom beckoned for us to get away from the window. I gave in right away, because my parents can be scary when we don't listen, but Mark lingered there a little while longer. I didn't see what he saw. Mark whispered that he saw somebody running. He said it looked like they were running away from something. My father turned off the lights. I found that odd and pushed my brother aside. He squinted out the window in silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he concluded nothing was there, just the wind in the trees. Then, the power went out. My parents have been acting weird ever since. During the day, my mom tried to keep us in the kitchen. She made breakfast, lunch, and dinner over the fireplace. She even broke out a board game in the afternoon, and we played for a couple hours. She kept asking about schoolwork or football or baseball or anything but the odd situation we were in. We tried to change the subject, tried to ask her what was happening outside, but it was no use. She ignored our questions. My father had a wild look in his eyes. Mark and I can't recall anything like it. He kept rushing to check the window every few minutes. Then he would sit down to check his cell phone, then back to the window, then back to his phone, like clockwork. Each rotation left him more agitated than the last. The cable didn't work. The internet had been spotty. There was really nothing to do but read a book or play a game. Mark asked to go for a walk before dinner. I thought Mom might pop the temple out of her forehead.
Nobody goes outside.
She snapped.
There could be live wires on the ground.
Mark snorted.
Watch your attitude and keep the windows closed.
I asked why, and she just stared at me with these deadly, fearful eyes that made me really uncomfortable. She looked like she wanted to tell me something, but my father answered instead. I didn't even realize he was listening. Nobody goes outside. I returned to my book without argument. I found one of my mom's old Stephen King collections and stumbled onto a story about rats in a basement bigger than a man. Time moved a little faster while I read. The walls of my house started to evaporate. It didn't take long for my imagination to disappear down the stairwell in the story, plunging further into the darkness with each step, listening to the untold things move around me perilously through the blackness. Somebody knocked on the door around 10 p.m. After an entire day of endless boredom, I thought this might be salvation. Maybe a maintenance worker, maybe a neighbor, maybe my friend from down the block finally convinced his mother to traverse the minefield of imaginary live wires. I got up from my chair to answer the door. My father sprinted across the room to block me. I don't think I'd ever seen him run before. He put his hand over my mouth. I tried to protest. He squeezed my arm. He didn't look angry. He looked scared. His eyes were on fire. It grew quiet outside, like somebody was listening. One finger over his lip told me to shut up. I looked over to my mom and saw her doing the same thing to my brother. He looked like he wanted to cry. The knocking resumed. The pace was pleasant at first, your typical formal but friendly. Then a pause. Then I was confused. Why were they scared? Why would a burglar knock? I thought that this could be somebody who could tell us what was going on, and it annoyed me that my parents were paranoid. So I got the idea to try saying something anyway. Not my best thought. "Help!" My father grabbed me by the throat and pushed me up against the wall. His sweaty palm slipped against my mouth. He raised one finger to his lips and held it there. My brother whimpered in the corner. The door hinges whined from the pressure of the knocks. My father reached into his pocket with the hand that was formally placed around my neck. I knew he had a knife in there. And just as soon as it had started, the knocking stopped. The house got quiet again. My father let go of me. It's been hours since the knocker left. My parents still won't talk to us. My mom is sleeping on the couch. My dad is sitting in front of the door with a gun across his lap. Can someone, anyone, please tell us what is happening in Fullerton City? I still can't find anything online. We are available through message and comments as long as our connection holds. I don't think I'll sleep much tonight. It's too quiet. Do you know what happens when you search online for Fullerton City now? This post comes up. I'm not quite sure how to describe that feeling. We are a community of hundreds, if not thousands of people, each with countless stories and worries of their own. You are only hearing one of them now. I cannot understand how our digital footprint could disappear overnight, but here we are. Day 2 in a missing city. I didn't get much sleep last night. Mark spent most of it glued to our bedroom window. He woke me and called me over every now and again. Sometimes he saw flashes of light in the distance. Sometimes he saw movement in the trees. Mostly, we saw fog. Thick blankets of it descended on our house like a comforter. It also never stopped raining. Big gusts of wind thumped the house hard enough to make us jump, but the most uncomfortable parts of the previous night were the periods of complete and total silence. Something about that quiet can really make you crazy. In any given suburb, there are a million background noises at once, even in a storm, even at night. Birds should be chirping, insects should be buzzing, car engines or motorcycles or air conditioners should all be gently humming in unison, but we didn't have any of that. Not a sound but our own, and the rain on the windows. I couldn't stop thinking about the neighborhood dogs. Shouldn't they be barking? There was one in particular, a yappy little thing called Caesar, which never passed up a good opportunity to wake you up in favor of a scrambling squirrel or rabbit. Did our neighbors have time to get them inside? Did something else happen to them? What had happened to Caesar? Mark woke me up for the final time around 5. I tried and failed to shrug him off. "I heard something in the street," he whispered. "Let's go." I asked him what he heard. "Clicking." He got up and walked towards the living room without another word. I didn't want to go. I was freaked out enough. I didn't and still don't need to add another messed up layer to this situation. Blissful ignorance is sometimes the best approach, but I got a gut feeling that this wasn't something that should be missed, and I didn't want Mark to be there alone for it, so I followed him. The hallway that leads to the living room passes by my parents' bedroom. We could hear my mother snoring softly on the other side. A baseball bat was propped up by her nightstand. Her cell phone was at the ready right beside it. We tiptoed past the creaking wood floor and arrived at the entrance to the kitchen. The clicking became clearer by that point. Mark pointed over to the alcove by the couch. I followed him to the corner. Then he stopped dead in his tracks. My father was sleeping with the gun in his hand. There was a window behind him that looked out into our entire living room. Staring through the other side was a giant black eyeball. We froze. The eye darted back and forth across the room. We were in plain sight, just standing there in the kitchen, but for some reason, the eye didn't seem to notice us. It passed by us a couple of times to focus on the toaster or something else. My father must have subconsciously read the tension in the air. He stirred and moved to roll over. When he did, thankfully, we locked eyes. I put one finger to my lips. A sober understanding dawned on his face. He took the safety off the gun. The eye responded to the movement of the gun and in one swift jolt disappeared from behind the window, leaving a wake of leaves and scattered footprints behind it. The air left my lungs. Something big ascended the wood steps to our porch. My dad turned to aim the gun. This time, we didn't need anyone to tell us. We all stayed quiet. We sat in still silence for the better part of the early morning. My mother awoke some hours later and got prepared to make breakfast, and only then did it feel safe enough to move around the house. Nobody told her what happened. I didn't think we needed to. My father certainly wasn't going to. I got the feeling from the look on his face that he would prefer to not talk at all for as long as he could. Mark returned to his spot by the window. Dad disappeared downstairs to get another box of ammo for his gun. I helped Mom cook over the fire, and we all went about our tasks in complete and total silence. Nobody tried to fake conversation anymore. There wasn't any point in arguing about what was out there. We had enough food, and we had enough water. Nobody was going anywhere. A knock came at the door just after noon. Each of us instantly stopped what we were doing. A sigh of relief echoed through the room when the familiar voice of our neighbor, Mr. Hollow, followed.
Richardson, you in there?
The door pounded harder.
No time to explain. Please, can you let us in?
My father walked in and stood awkwardly between my mother and the door. I could tell that he would prefer to ignore it, but she would never let him live it down. The true married man's dilemma.
Please, folks, if you're in there, open up. We don't have a lot of time.
Mark shook his head.
Please.
He begged.
Jean is hurt.
My mom bit her nails. Dad gave in and reluctantly looked through the peephole. Satisfied with his view of the other side, he slid the pistol into his back pocket, unlatched the lock, and opened the door.
Thank you.
Mr. Hollow is a big, burly guy. He took my father into his arms and slapped his back so hard the sound echoed down the hall. He moved over to chase my mother down for a kiss on the cheek as his wife and daughter trailed meekly behind.
Thank you.
He bellowed.
Thank you. We didn't know if we would see anybody else.
My dad nodded awkwardly. My mom stepped up and hugged Mrs. Hollow tight. A quiet, pitiful moan escaped her lips as she did. The two of them were usually thick as thieves. My neighbor was a nice lady, the type that usually never shuts up, but now she couldn't get a word out. A thin line of blood trickled behind her foot. It didn't take long to notice the source. Her slacks were cut from the ankle to the knee. My dad slammed the door.
Come on, Jeannie.
My mother cooed.
Let's get you cleaned up.
The two of them walked hand in hand to the kitchen. Mr. Hollow sat down on our couch and wiped the sweat from his forehead and t-shirt. His daughter, Alice, perched herself neatly on the arm beside him.
Like I said,
he said while catching his breath.
Luckily, we found somebody.
My dad nodded again.
Did you see it?
Mark asked.
Whatever's out there, I mean.
Mr. Hollow stared back at him. He took a second before he spoke, like he wanted to pick his words, which didn't quite fit for a guy like him.
One of them got into the house,
he said definitively.
An open window downstairs. We trapped it in the basement.
My father held up his hand.
Didn't feel safe staying there, though.
My father interrupted.
Enough,
he whispered.
Take a break, Mike. Let's talk.
Mr. Hollow nodded in bewilderment. He got up and shuffled after my father towards the dining room, leaving Mark and I uncomfortably with Alice. Alice Hollow is around my age. She's short, with dark hair and dark eyes. She has this awkwardly adorable round head that she covers up with a bow or a pin or some other new accessory every other day. I've had a crush on her since grade school. I know that's probably not relevant, but I just want to point out what may later become obvious. Mark elbowed me in the ribs. I ignored it.
So, did you see anything?
I asked.
Like, did you see anybody out there?
She paused and then shook her head.
Well, what does it look like outside?
Mark asked.
Normal.
She answered.
Quiet.
And you really didn't see anything? I asked again. When it started, I mean. She looked at me and shook her head, paused, then relented.
We were all inside sleeping, like you probably were. It was late. Or early. I don't know. My dad was upstairs. I was upstairs. My mom doesn't sleep much, so she was doing some laundry in the basement.
She hesitated.
I don't know what woke me up first. Her screaming or the power going out. They both seemed to happen at the same time. My dad started shouting her name. You know, Jeannie, Jeannie. And my mom was just wailing from the basement. We both got to the kitchen and we could see her running up the steps. She was screaming at my dad. You know, close the door, close the door. But my dad couldn't stop looking at whatever was behind her. He just froze.
Right, Mark whispered. Can't blame him.
So I reach out and slam the door, just as my mom makes it through. And something wedges itself in the doorway.
Holy shit.
I murmured.
What was it?
I don't know. Something thick and sharp. Like a claw, I guess. It was wet, too. It left a stain. Anyway, I couldn't get the door shut because of it. I was panicking. I kicked my dad in the shin, and he threw his body weight against the frame. The lock finally clicked, and we heard whatever it was fall down the stairs on the other side.
She paused.
It didn't come up again.
My father reemerged from the dining room some moments after our awkward silence. Mr. Hollow trailed sheepishly behind.
Who's ready to eat?
We ate our fire-cooked meal in relative silence. All four parents made it abundantly clear through menacing stares that the topic of the shit show outside would not be discussed with children present. Mark again asked if he could go for a walk. Nobody dignified him with a response. After our dishes were done and disposed of, we retreated into various alcoves of our suddenly cramped 3-bedroom. Mark and I went back to our room. Alice set up shop in the office with her mom. My mother retired to the bed early, and both dads sat guard in the living room. The house grew quiet again. The wind and rain finally seemed to slow down. My Stephen King novella kept me company. I couldn't help but empathize with the main character. Somewhere in between the tales of rats in armor, bat rats, and albino rats who never saw the sun, sleep came easily and comfortably under my familiar warm sheets. I woke up to a rude shaking. Alice was standing over me. She didn't say anything. I guess she didn't have to. Mark and I rubbed the last remaining ounce of sleep out of our eyes and followed her wordlessly into the office. 2 cots were set up in the room. One looked disheveled. The other was still made. Alice pointed to the open window. Her mother was gone. My hometown is dying, and I don't want to die with it. I know it sounds ridiculous to be lamenting on the internet while the world is melting around me. At the moment, it definitely feels ridiculous, but you have to understand. If we don't survive, which we almost certainly won't, this story will be my town's last living record. That's important to me. That's important to them. I have to let someone know what happened here, even if it's only you. The truth is obvious now. We are being exterminated. This town and its people are being erased. Fullerton City is all but wiped from the collective subconscious already. All that's remaining are the survivors, the creatures, and this story. I'll keep it going as long as they let me. I don't know why this is happening. I don't particularly care. Not anymore. I just want to get out of here. This will be my last message from inside my childhood home. The only thing I've ever known. My brother and I have decided that we won't die here. Mark packed a couple of essentials in our school backpack. The only thing that's remaining is this laptop and a frank conversation with my parents. I know they're scared. We're all scared, but we have to do something. Mrs. Hollow didn't come back last night. Alice only stopped crying long enough to tell the adults what she knew, which wasn't much. She fell asleep sometime around midnight. Her mother was in the room at the time.
She was acting strange, though, you know?
She sobbed.
She just kept repeating the same things over and over, and her face was white. Like really, really white. I thought it was just shock over what happened. The scratch, the attack, you know? I didn't know. I didn't know.
Mr. Hollow was inconsolable.
Well, we have to find her, Jack.
He bellowed.
Me, you, and the boys. Alice can come too if she's up to it. We've got weapons, don't we? We've got a small arsenal here, Richardson. They're big, but the damn things are stupid enough that—
My father just shook his head and pursed his lips.
Nobody is going out there. The hell they're not! I won't risk my family's safety,
Dad insisted.
especially not at night.
Mr. Hollow's already red face turned a particular shade of scarlet. He looked like he might blow a gasket. Then he calmed himself and delivered the next bit like a sermon.
Fine.
He spit.
Stay inside and cower. Lie to your kids. Keep them underneath the covers long enough, and maybe they won't think there's monsters outside. You raise your family how you want, asshole, but don't you dare tell me how to take care of mine.
Mark looked down at his feet. I avoided my father's glance.
Alice, let's go.
Mr. Hollow beckoned.
Get what you got. Please.
My father interrupted.
Just wait a minute. We're not staying.
Mr. Hollow finished.
You're not convincing me to abandon my wife out there. You know me better than that, Jack.
My father reached out and handed him a gun.
We have extra.
He paused.
You'll need it more.
Mr. Hollow nodded awkwardly. He took the pistol and stuffed it into an oversized coat pocket before turning and heading for the door. My mom met him there with some bread and other things stuffed into a plastic bag. There wasn't much, but I think she felt like she had to do something, and she looked like she wanted to say more, but she didn't. Alice reached out and gave me a warm hug. She held on longer than expected. Right around that time, I really wished she would stay, not because of my feelings for her, but because a piece of each of us knew what would happen next. It all just happened so fast.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Mr. Hollow shook each of our hands one last time. My father opened the door for him. Without another word, the pair descended the front porch into a thick evening fog. Alice turned back to wave. Then she turned around, and they were gone. My father shut the door. Dad shuffled back to the couch and collapsed. Mom waited at the door like they might change their minds. Mark perched at the window. He looked over and shook his head at me as if to say, "Not good." Just as an all too familiar clicking echoed down the block. I could feel my body instinctively tensing. I had no true preparation for what came next. The sound started quietly before it seemed to fill the air. Soon, it was as if 1,000 crickets suddenly invaded Fullerton and all decided to chirp at the same time. The ringing, awful cacophony of it was deafening. Somebody outside screamed. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman. The chirping erupted even louder and seemed to devour their voice. My father held his head in his hands. He motioned for us to block our ears. My mother started to cry. Underneath the clicking, underneath the screams, one word became clearer as it was repeated over and over again in the distance.
Jeannie! Jeannie! Jeannie!
The gun went off soon after.
Jeannie!
One shot at first, then 2, 3, 4 in quick succession. Somebody else started screaming. I knew that had to be Alice. The pain behind the screams made my stomach turn. The gun went off one more time.
Jeannie!
The clicking dissipated. The screams stopped. And then, it was quiet again. My father got up and quietly led my brother away from the window. Mom fell to a heap in front of the couch. I could feel the tears forming in the corner of my eyes and desperately fought them back.
You knew this would happen.
I accused my dad.
Why did you let her go?
He stared back at me. His eyes were cold.
You knew they would die, and you just sent them out anyway.
Heavy footsteps echoed on the porch. My mother couldn't control her sobs. My father dropped onto the floor to silence her. It was no use. The two of them ended up in this awkward wrestling embrace. The pounding outside continued.
We killed them,
Mark whimpered.
and now they're going to kill us.
Then, the office window.
They're checking for weaknesses,
Mark whispered.
trying to find a way in.
The sound ascended to the roof. Heavy footsteps paced back and forth above us. The chimney kicked back smoke.
It's too small.
My father murmured.
They can't fit. Please, God, they can't fit.
My mother wrapped her arms around her head. The knocking surrounded us. There had to be a dozen of them, all checking various points of entry, all clicking their disturbingly loud song in unison. Staying quiet would be no use. They had to know we were inside. Mark gestured for me to look through the peephole. I squinted and noticed something in the distance. It was still dark, but the sun started to rise on the horizon, and with it came a few tentative beads of light which softly illuminated the neighborhood. I realized I was staring at the home of Yappy Caesar. Standing in front of it was something I hoped to never see again. The creature stood at least 2 to 3 times the height of a man. It held itself up on 2 massive legs that bent wildly at the knee, almost like pincers, and behind it were smaller legs that trailed behind sort of uselessly. I thought at the time that they looked like fins. One of the bent legs reached out at my neighbor's glass. There was a moment's pause. Their window opened. I had to fight my instincts as a woman leaned outside as if to greet the creature, which gently took her into its hind legs and rambled down the hill. The unrelenting clicking soon gave way to the scurrying of heavy footsteps. A massive weight lifted itself off our roof. The sun came up. We were alone again. We have to leave today. We can't take no for an answer. We have no choice. These things know we're here. They will get inside tonight. If I don't make it, you know what happened, but please, wish me luck. I feel better knowing that some trace of my town will live on here. Signed, respectively, Mark 12 Penn Court, Fullerton City, New Jersey. I can hardly describe driving through the complete devastation of my hometown. We passed dozens of familiar homes from over the years. Some of them had bullet holes, some had bent frames or broken glass, some had dead bodies in their front yards. And I tried not to look at those too long, because I knew the faces. But it's hard to stop yourself from looking once you start, you know? I saw Alice, I saw Mr. Hollow, I saw neighbors, I saw friends. Some of them died running, some died fighting, but all of them seemed to end up the same way, in scattered bits and pieces, cast like trash, almost decorating their own immaculately made front lawns. My father drove the car. Only one road led us out of town, but it passed through a few hiccups along the way. The supermarket on Grand Street sat behind 2 apartment complexes that tended to be crowded. The gas station on Main would allow us to fill up, but they didn't call it Main for nothing, and more people would almost certainly lead to more problems. All of these issues swirled around my head in unison, with the backdrop of my entire town carved up like origamis right in front of my face. And my dad didn't even seem fazed by it. He actually hummed for the first 10 minutes of the drive. My dad is not the type to hum. At first, I thought it might be a nervous thing, but then my mother started to join him. Guys? Mark glued himself to the car window. He wouldn't look at me, not even a shared glance of misery. I knew from his reaction that something bad was about to happen. I guess I just didn't want to admit it to myself. Dad? My father slowed down around the grocery store. He pulled into the lot unceremoniously, as if it were any other Tuesday, while the corpses of our neighbors lined the streets among us, clearly baking in the heat of the rising sun. I actually thought we hit one of them. What are we doing? I asked. Nobody answered. Hello? My father parked the car. He leaned over to give my mom a peck on the forehead. She nodded and smiled back. After a moment of silence, he gingerly unclipped the seatbelt and moved to get out. Nobody bothered to stop him. Dad! I shouted. Wait, are you serious? You can't go out there! He smiled at me one last time. Looking back, I like to think that there was still some small part of my dad in that smile. He looked like a weight had just been lifted from his shoulders, like he got us this far, like his job was done. I didn't understand it then. I do now. I only saw the scratch when he got up, right above the belt, hip to hip. His shirt had always been tucked. My mother took a deep breath. Mom? I whimpered. Mom, no, please. She looked back at me and grasped my hand. She was cold to the touch. Mark whimpered something small. I knew then that he knew all along. It happened the first night, he whispered. They can't fight it anymore. It won't let them. The car door opened. Mom, you can't go out there. She pulled her hand away. Mom, please.
It's okay, honey. Okay, honey?
She got out of the car and sprinted after my father. I never saw my mom sprint before. She looked so strange doing it. I watched the two of them go towards the store, hand in hand. In a moment, they were there, and the next, they were gone. We have to follow them, I begged. Please! A soft boom sounded from somewhere inside. Okay, he whispered hesitantly, but be ready to run when I say run. Deal? A second boom followed. Deal, I muttered. I'm the oldest, he insisted. We don't know what we're going to see inside there. You have to listen to me. Shut up and let's go! We hopped out of the car and ran across the empty lot. Rain and heavy wind swooped in with our arrival. Mark slipped and fell into a particularly nasty pool of blood. I raced back to help him. By the time we both made it inside, our parents were gone. We looked around for a minute. The store seemed to be shelled. Overturned shelves made it difficult to get around. Smeared floors made the entire place stink worse than a slaughterhouse. At the center of the store was a staircase that leads to the basement level. Normally, larger items like water jugs are stored down there. We got the distinct feeling that we weren't totally alone, because we could hear some kind of movement in that area, so we moved towards it. Mark found some cover behind a blown-out register. We used it to peek downstairs. An enormous pit sat below us. We couldn't actually see where it ended. Mark picked up a can and dropped it. 10 to 15 seconds later, it made contact with the bottom. The closer we inched toward the center, the more that movement seemed rhythmic, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. We heard footsteps. Mark ripped my collar and pulled me back. Approaching the center of the store were a man and woman who both looked familiar to me from different places. That was my first thought, that they must be together without me realizing, and that it really is a small city after all. The couple walked up casually to the edge of the pit. They looked at each other and smiled. Then they jumped, hand in hand, as if expecting to land in a ball pit. The splat came after the boom. The store grew quiet. Something seemed to be slurping down below. What? Mark whispered. You don't think... It drinks the blood. Suddenly, the pulsing grew louder. Horrible scraping ripped somewhere below it. I can't adequately describe the sound, almost like a giant moth breaking its way out of a cocoon. A familiar rhythm to the din took over. Checking for weaknesses, Mark muttered, even at birth. Time to go, Mark shouted. Definitely, I answered. Each of us put in our best track performances to date. The building gave way as if an earthquake was underneath it. We skidded out of the entrance just as the overhang dipped down to smash the carousel door. My brother got to the car before me. He jumped into the driver's seat, and thank God the keys were still in the ignition. He smashed the gas and all but left me with the passenger door popped open. I hopped in at the last possible moment. The store collapsed behind me. Mark doesn't know shit about driving, and neither do I, but any idiot can hit the gas and steer away from an explosion. We picked up speed while debris rocked the car. Just as we got back on the road, Mark pointed into the rear view, and I wish he didn't. Standing in the wake of the grocery store was a creature 3 times its size. I didn't look at it twice. We managed to drive to the gas station before nightfall. We found it pretty much untouched. I don't think anybody else made it that far. We took the mountain road into the next town and drove past sundown. We are safe and sound now in a place called White Valley. The people here are friendly, but none of them, including the sheriff, can tell me a damn thing about Fullerton or what happened to it these past few days. Go figure. I hope more than anything that this post can help drive more survivors out of the woodwork. Please, please, message me if you or someone you know lived through the attack on Fullerton City. I can't overstress the importance of that plea. We cannot let our town be forgotten. One day, we will go back. I don't care if it's just Mark and me. I know we can find the entrance the same way we found the exit. We don't expect to find anybody alive. That's just hope that's not worth having. But we all have a right to know what is living there instead. Signing off for now, Matt. I've got a few bodies here at location Windsor Mill. April 2nd. It has been 4 days now, and it still has not moved away from in front of the door. I came across this journal earlier today while I was going through all of the supplies, trying to figure out what I have to work with and what I might have to ration, and I thought that writing in it would be a good way to pass the time until either help comes or I see a chance to run for it. After all, since there's no electricity up here, I don't have a television or a radio to keep myself occupied. And even if I did, I doubt that I could bring myself to turn them on. Even the idea of making more noise than I have to, of really making any noise at all, fills me with dread. It's mostly due to the fact that I don't want to attract its attention any more than I already have, and give it further reason to continue sticking around, and, admittedly, somewhat because I worry about being unable to hear any possible changes outside. This constant paranoia makes it a challenge to even try reading some of the books and magazines that we brought up here with us. I can't really bring myself to concentrate on whatever it is I'm trying to read. I'm too distracted, too busy jumping out of my skin over every creak of timber or gust of wind to really focus on any of it. I read the words, and then the door crowds them back out of my mind. The sounds it makes during the night makes it impossible to do anything other than cower up here in the loft, staring unblinkingly down at the door and praying to God to just make this thing go away already, or for the sun to come up so that at least it will quiet back down for the day. Sometimes I honestly don't know which is worse, the tense silence during the days or listening to the door creak and moan as whatever the hell that thing is pushes on it all night long while endlessly, wordlessly screaming at me. No, the nights are worse, and I know it. And so I have decided to start writing in this journal, so that I'll at least have something to do with my time other than just sitting here and staring at the door all day, just waiting for something to happen and praying that nothing will. The journal must be one of Katie's. She's always scribbling and writing in these things, especially when we come up here to the cabin, but I'm certain she won't mind my using it. God, I hope she's all right. I hope that she's found help. April 3rd. Still no changes last night. It started its screaming a few hours after sunset, pushing heavily on the door, seemingly trying to force its way inside. I honestly don't know which is worse, The fact that the sound is so incredibly human in nature, or the fact that something about it simultaneously makes it glaringly inhuman and unnatural. There's something about it, some quality that seems somewhat familiar and yet at the same time utterly alien to me. The vague feeling of familiarity frightens me more than anything else somehow. It makes me think of an article I read once years ago about something called the Uncanny Valley. They said that it described feeling a revulsion towards something that closely imitated human life, but was still obviously something else. I can't think of a better term for the sounds this thing makes. Each morning after the sun has come up and the thing has gone quiet for the day, I have removed my barricades and inspected the door, and so far, it still seems to be holding up fairly well. The hinges and lock remain firm and unbent, despite the creaking I have heard during the nighttime's assault. The wood doesn't seem to be cracking or warping anywhere. I've braced it up as best as I could with what I have, but I don't really have much to work with. What furniture there is, a few assorted tools, a bit of rope. I don't know that wedging the couch up against the door is going to do much good, but it's at least something. No. I think that it has everything to do with the quality of the door itself. My father really put his heart into it years ago when he built this place, and he built everything in here to last, from the roof to the door. All that had meant before was that Katie and I would have a nice place in the mountains for years to come, where we could get away from the city for a while. A place where we could enjoy being in nature, in the smell of fresh air, and just being together with each other. Now, his craftsmanship seems to be the only thing standing between me and I don't even know. Thank God he decided against putting any windows in place when he built it. The fireplace still worries me, but I imagine that it must be too narrow for that thing to fit down. At least, I hope it is. I spent this morning gathering up all of the empty buckets, jars, and tubs that I could find, filling them with water I could get from the hand pump he built in the kitchen. I don't honestly even know why I did it. I really can't see how it would reasonably be able to tamper with the well or affect the water supply, and yet, at the same time, it feels like the right thing to do. Besides, the last thing I need to do is run out of water somehow, and a bit of precaution isn't going to hurt anything. If nothing else, it gave me something to occupy my time with. There's enough canned food stored up here to last me for quite some time, especially if I rationed it a bit, but I hope there won't be much of a need to worry about that. I have to imagine that whatever is out there is going to get tired of trying to get at me or waiting on me to come out, or that help comes, but it's always better to be safe than sorry. It's hard to believe that just 5 days ago, Katie and I were driving up here, laughing like we were teenagers again, talking about when we wanted to go for a hike and when we wanted to do some fishing and how nice it was going to be to get out of the city for an entire month and just how much we needed it. To think, that was less than a week ago, and now it somehow seems like a memory from another time, like seeing something from someone else's life. Despite how much we had enjoyed the drive up here, I had known that something was wrong almost as soon as we got out of the car. At first, I could not figure out what seemed to be bothering me, but as we were carrying things from the car and unpacking, the wind had changed. A strange odor, almost a sort of musk, had drifted in and out of the forest on the breeze, and when I smelled it, I had nearly dropped the box I was carrying. I saw the color drain from Katie's face when she came back outside and smelled it as well. She asked me what it could be while covering her nose with her shirt, but I told her I didn't know. I had no answer for her, as it was nothing quite like I had ever smelled before. It wasn't a particularly strong smell, or even all that putrid, but there had been something wrong about it. Something invasive and unclean. You see, my father had been bringing me up here and on camping trips for as long as I could remember, and so I was no stranger to the smells of death and decay. I could still remember that once when I was young, we had been hiking and found a dead deer in the water, and that he hadn't been able to get the smell entirely out of our clothes for days. But this was something entirely different. The instant I had smelled it, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, and my stomach had tightened into a knot. I had felt the overpowering urge to climb back into the car, start driving, and never ever look back. The need to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was causing the smell. I had told Katie as much, and though it obviously bothered her as well, she had laughed and told me that it was only some dead thing out in the woods. That I was being silly and getting upset over nothing. Now, looking back at how pale her face had been and how nervous that laugh had sounded, I know that she hadn't really believed that. God, why couldn't she have just trusted me? Were you just too proud to admit that you felt the same feelings of terror that I had? Or maybe it had simply been because it took us so long to get the time off from work for the trip in the first place. It had taken more than a couple sacrifices on both of our parts, but we had known that it was really going to be worth it. Maybe that's why she refused to go, and maybe it's how she finally convinced me to stay. And so, instead, we had continued unloading the car, unpacking everything we would need, getting ready to settle in for the next month together. I had been unable to keep myself from glancing at the forest any time we were outside, half expecting to see something, though I could not say what, out there in the shadows. I had known that Katie was right, that something had simply died nearby, and yet, no matter how many times I told myself that, I still could not quite make myself believe it. I don't think Katie did either, though she hid it better than I could. It seemed as though the longer we were around the smell, the more intense my discomfort became, and I felt the first aching pains of a tension headache begin to steadily spread from the back of my head. By the end, I think the only thing that had really kept me here was the fact that I was going to propose to her while we were up here. I can't even stand to look at the ring right now, and I know that I won't be able to until I know that she's safe, that she's all right. Until I can know that, until I can hold her in my arms again, it has become nothing more than a symbol of how much I might have lost, and what a fool I was for letting us stay. Katie, wherever you are, know that I love you. April 4th. Still no changes to report, just another night of that damned thing trying to force in the door, screaming at me hour after hour, all through the night. Why does it scream like that? Is it hoping that it can scare me out of my little hole here? Thinking that it can frighten me into making some sort of run for it? Could it serve some sort of purpose beyond my understanding? Perhaps it's intelligent and just derives some sort of sick pleasure from knowing that it's tormenting me in here. I'm not about to try asking it. I have enough difficulty just bringing myself to the door in order to check it for damages anymore. Just knowing that it's sitting there on the other side, waiting, it's just too much for me to handle at this point. I know that I should man up and move the rubber stopper away from the bottom of the door, that I should be trying to watch it and see if he either comes or goes or just incessantly sits there, waiting day in and day out. I know that I should, but I can't bring myself to do it. I just can't handle the idea of those eyes staring in here under the door. That would have been even worse than the screaming, and that's already more than I can bear. I saw them once, and that was more than enough. My headache has grown steadily worse as the day has gone on until it has become almost unbearable, and I knew that I would have to lie down for a while. Katie had suggested that it was most likely due to the change in altitude during the drive up here, that she knew it could sometimes cause headaches like this. Of course, I reminded her that this had never happened to me before and that I had been coming up here for years now. She simply reminded me that I was getting old and that these things happen. Eventually, I settled for taking some aspirin to help ease the pain in my head, climbing up into the loft and lying down in bed while she finished unpacking things and setting up around the cabin. I had made her promise to wake me if she needed anything and not to go too far from the cabin until I had woken up. I didn't even want her to go outside without me, but I knew that she would have been upset by that. In the end, she told me that I was being silly, but promised nonetheless. And I had fallen asleep almost immediately after lying down. When I awoke, the smell had become a stench overpowering enough to leave me gagging. I cannot properly describe it, even now, after having spent all these days with it. Have you ever been down in an old root cellar or some damp, dark place in the earth? Perhaps a house that was recently flooded or suffered from a long leaking roof. That damp, musty, clinging smell of mildew and mold. There was something of both of those to it. Added to that, there were traces of rot and putrefaction. There was also a cloying, almost sickly sweet quality to it that was somehow even worse than the stink of decay. Something acidic, almost chemical as well. It was a dozen terrible smells all wrapped into one repugnant, awful stench. Finally, I could hold back no longer. I leaned over to the side of the bed and heaved onto the floor. Once I had finished, I called out to Katie, but received no response. I felt weak and bewildered as I tried to climb out of the bed, and I practically fell into my own vomit more than once. I called out to her again, more urgently now. Still nothing. I began to cry out to her, frantically. Nothing. I made my way down to the ladder to the floor of the cabin, and in my haste and current state, I nearly fell at one point. I might have broken my neck if I had fallen from that high, and part of me wishes that I had. I wandered the cabin, coughing and choking from the smell, occasionally stopping to retch and heave until I realized that she was not here with me. I turned towards the door, stumbling towards it, feeling my panic grow with every passing second. I knew that I had to find her. I knew that I had to find her. That I had to find her and get her in the car and get us as far away from this place as possible, no matter how silly it might have sounded to her. As I drew closer to the door, the smell became steadily stronger, and I realized that whatever it was coming from must have moved closer somehow. As I reached out for the door, I was overcome by a sense of dread. I suddenly knew that I could no more bring myself to reach out and twist that knob than I could pluck the moon from the sky or sprout wings and fly away from this place. No. Some part of me, some animal instinct residing quietly until now in the back of my brain knew that I must not open that door, and held me back from doing so. For reasons equally beyond my understanding, I instead dropped down and pulled away at the rubber stopper that we had installed upon the bottom of the door. You see, as the cabin had settled and subtly shifted over the years, a small gap had formed beneath the bottom of the door. It was no more than a couple of inches, but still enough to let in a draft or a bit of rain if the wind blew the right way. So we had installed a bit of rubber along the bottom to properly seal it up. I pulled that away now, and despite how strong the smell was as it poured through the new gap, I leaned down and looked outside. Darkness. Or at least what I at first took to be darkness, all across the bottom of the door. All that I could see was pure, unbroken black. I was momentarily confused. It had still been fairly early in the morning when we had arrived and I had laid down. Surely I hadn't slept that long. I looked at my watch only to discover that it was barely past 3 in the afternoon, meaning that I had only slept for a couple of hours. I sat there in confusion for a moment, trying to piece it all together, and looked beneath the door once again. The longer I looked out, the more and more I came to realize that I was not looking into some lightless distance, but rather at an object lying before the door. From what I could tell, it seemed to be incredibly smooth, and though I could not be certain, the way that it had caught the light from inside made it seem as though its surface might be either a damp or slimy texture. The first thing to spring to mind was some colossal black slug laid out before the doorway, and I nearly vomited once again. As I lay there staring at it, I noticed that a spot on its surface was becoming gradually lighter than the rest. I fixed my eye upon it and watched with mixed horror and curiosity as a white object about the size of a quarter seemed to arise from within the substance to sit upon the surface. The only way in which I can describe it is to say that it looked somewhat like a peeled grape, except that it was entirely white. As I watched, more began to steadily surface, ranging in size from a dime to what I would estimate was likely closer to my fist. All of them looked like peeled albino grapes. I laid for some time, watching these things, trying to figure out what I was seeing when it began to dawn on me. I slowly slid myself across the floor to the other side of the doorway, and they watched, followed me in my movement. They were eyes. I screamed then and launched myself back away from the door, moving as far away as possible. Eventually, I fought down my revulsion to come close enough to push the rubber stopper back against the space beneath the door, unable to bear the idea of that thing watching me. That night, the screaming began. April 6. Nothing new to report, I'm afraid. It shrieks all night long and squats there in front of the door during the day. Yesterday, in the afternoon, I finally managed to work up enough courage to move the piece of rubber to the side and look out through the gap. It was still there, but thank God I managed to move the rubber back into place before it had time to bring about those damned eyes. I'm beginning to worry that it's not just going to lose interest and leave, that it's not going to give up on me like a bear or a wolf might after waiting for a little while. I'm beginning to think that so long as I'm in here, it's going to go on sitting there, waiting. I got to hope that Kelly got away, that she made it down out of the mountains and she's bringing someone, that she's bringing help. Unless she is, then I feel as though I might as well be stranded on the moon. I'm running low on aspirin. I've been suffering from constant headaches since that first day that make the waking hours almost intolerable sometimes. It's at its worst at night. With that thing at the door screaming away hour after hour, my head pounding and feeling as though it's about to split in two, my heart racing away in my chest. Sometimes it becomes too much to stand and I pass out. Whenever I awaken from these faints, I feel a mixture of relief and terror. Relief, of course, because I managed to escape at least a few hours of that thing's harassment and the pain in my head, and terrified by the prospect of what could have happened if I had been in such a state when it finally managed to force the door open. At least if I'm awake, I might have a chance to escape, to get away. Or maybe it would be better if I was unconscious when it got in here. Maybe being awake for that is the last thing I should want. I'm also beginning to suffer from nausea. I don't know if it's from the headaches, the smell, or just living in this state of constant tension, but it seems as though I can hardly keep anything down anymore. Sometimes even looking at the cans of food is enough to make me feel ill. I know that I need to eat, that I have to keep my strength up until help arrives, but all I want to do is lie down in the darkness and try to sleep and escape from all of this. Even that is becoming less and less of an escape due to the nightmares I've been having. April 11th. Katie is dead. I know that now. April 11th. Katie is dead. I know that now. I have begun to worry more and more about the door. It's holding up fine for now, but how many more nights before it starts to let go? It's fine now, yes, but about a week from now, or 2? Because of that fact, I have been forcing myself to listen more closely at nights, trying to listen for the sounds of the wood beginning to crack or the groan of nails slowly pushing loose, anything at all that might warn me about the door coming apart. By doing that, however, I've also found myself listening more closely to him, to it. The more that I listened, the more that feeling of familiarity has been growing, until finally I knew that I must have heard it somewhere before. But where? The only thing I can relate it to is perhaps when you hear the Wilhelm scream in a movie. You might not immediately know where you recognize it from, but you know you've heard it somewhere before. I had been lying there in bed, listening to the door for a few hours, when I had looked up and noticed a small black spider crawling across one of the beams. I lied there, watching it as it made its way across the beam, enjoying the simple distraction from the noise going on outside and the pain in my head, until at last, he climbed up into the shadows and out of my sight. Spiders of all sorts are hardly an uncommon sight up here in the cabin, and more than once I had thought it was strange that I hadn't seen any of them around the cabin since all this began. Normally I would have seen a dozen by now, and silly as it might sound, merely being able to see another living thing, even a little spider, came as something of a relief to me. I had never been bothered by the spiders we would find up here, even though Katie had always been terrified of them. More often than not, if she saw one, she would scream. The realization hit me like a brick, and suddenly I understood. It was her scream. And that thing had been mimicking the sounds that I had heard her make this entire time. I don't even remember how I got down from the loft, especially without breaking my neck, but I suddenly found myself standing before the door, knocking and shoving the furniture out of the way, pounding at the wood with my clenched fists. I screamed every curse and obscenity I could think of at the thing, yelled every threat I could imagine. For a moment, I even considered finding something I might be able to use against it. Maybe some oil and fire from the lamps. I would throw the bolt from the door and throw the burning oil at the thing in the hopes that just maybe the thing would be burned to death. It was an insane, stupid idea, and I didn't care. I just wanted to find a way to hurt this thing, to make it suffer somehow, even if it cost me my life in the process. As I stood at the door, my body shaking with rage and grief, clenching my bloodied fists, I realized that the thing had grown silent at some point. The only sounds to be heard was my panting and the sounds of blood pounding my ears. Had I actually startled the thing? Had it been somehow confused by this sudden change in our nightly routine? Was it simply too intent on listening to me to bother continuing making noises of its own? The silence was broken by the sound of a small giggle. It was that small, innocent sort of laughter that is unique to a small child. The one that they seem to reserve for the discovery of something new and curious, or perhaps something that amuses them in a certain way. If you have ever spent much time around children, then you will know the sound that I mean. And this damned thing squatting there on the other side of the door made that same noise. And in its own way, it was even more terrible and obscene than its caricature of what must have been my Katie's last moments. When I understood what this must mean, that a child... Oh God, please no. It had been too much for my mind to bear, and I reeled back from the door, collapsing onto the floor and blacking out. The only good thing to come from the whole ordeal was that my unconsciousness went unbothered by the nightmares that now seem to plague me whenever I attempt to sleep. And so now I know that I am on my own, that Katie is not going to bring help. She is gone, and I am alone up here, utterly alone with it. My only hope is to last long enough for people to realize that something must have happened, long enough for them to send people up here to check on us. I have enough supplies to last that long, especially with how little I've been able to bring myself to eat lately. All that matters now is that the door continues to hold out. Katie, I will always love you. April 15th. It is making me ill somehow. I don't know how, but it is. I have no appetite to speak of, and when I try to eat, it seems as though I can barely keep anything down but a bit of water. Even more troubling, however, is the fact that even though I haven't eaten anything solid in the past 2 days, I don't seem to be losing weight. How is that even possible? How can a man not eat for days and somehow not lose any weight? Honestly, I doubt that I would like any of the answers that I might find, and so I try to avoid thinking about it too deeply. My migraines are constant and agonizing, especially since I ran out of aspirin a few days ago and have nothing else to help ease the pain. Anything but the dimmest light is unbearable to me now, and when it screams during the night, it is torture. I sit here while it shrieks and howls and sputters, pulling at my hair and grinding my teeth, thrashing around in the bed, feeling as though someone is driving white-hot needles into my brain. The fact that I know now whose scream it really is does not ease my suffering. Sometimes now when I cough, I have begun to notice small black specks, like dried blood. Yet another thing which I prefer not to think about too deeply. My skin has begun to itch incessantly, and I'm beginning to develop a rash on several different parts of my body, somehow similar to the one I got from poison ivy when I had been a boy. My days have become a never-ending parade of misery, and sometimes I have to wonder if it's really worth it to keep going on. When I try to escape this hell by falling asleep, all I seem to find is a different one. My sleep is filled with nightmares, each seemingly worse than the last, to the point that even the pain in my head is at times preferable to sleep. Last night I dreamed that Katie was standing on a barren, black plain that stretched off as far as the eye could see. her arms outstretched to me, beckoning me closer. As I approached, I could see things moving beneath the skin of her face and arms, like worms, writhing and twisting away just beneath the surface of her skin. I tried to turn away from her, to run, but discovered that I could not. My body kept walking towards this thing that looked like my Katie, but wasn't, and I couldn't even force a scream from my throat. At one point as I drew near, her eyes turned black and seemed to melt, oozing slowly down her cheeks. When I was nearly within arm's reach, her mouth began to slowly open, stretching impossibly wide, and inside, it was full of those writhing things. She began to lean forward, and thankfully I woke up. Some of them are like that. Others are stranger still. More surreal, bizarre landscapes populated by freakish creatures. Things that I almost doubt you could imagine. Things that I can't even begin to know how to describe. I usually awaken from these dreams in a cold sweat, my heart racing and my head pounding, feeling the need to vomit even though I know there's nothing in my stomach to vomit up. The worst of them are when I am in one of these bizarre places, looking at some of these things, and I can tell that they are somehow looking back at me. Those are the worst, and they seem to haunt me even when I'm awake. All I can do is hope that help arrives before things get any worse. That I can last until someone comes up here to check on us. I don't want to die up here in the mountains, alone with that thing. I don't want to die. April 19th. It called to me last night, pleading with me to open the door, to come out and join her. Dear God, it called out to me in her voice. April 26th. There is no God, but there are many gods. There is no heaven, but there are endless hells. I have heard the flutes in the darkness. I have heard 1,000 whispered names. April 29th. This will be my last entry. I now realize that even if help did come, even if they somehow managed to get me out of here, it would now be too late for me. You see, more and more lately I've been scratching at my rashes, unable to stop myself really. As I scratched and dug at them last night, I accidentally tore open one of the larger blisters, and when I moved away from the torn skin, I saw that inside of it there was an eye, like the ones on that thing outside. A tiny white grape, staring up at me from my own skin. I cut it out, but I know that it doesn't matter at this point. I know that for whatever reason, it's turning me into something else, trying to make me into something inhuman. I'm not going to let it. I've used the rope that I found to tie myself a noose, and I've hung it from the rafters up in the loft. It should be more than strong enough to hold me, or at least for as long as I should need it to. With any luck, it will be long enough to break my neck when I jump. I think I deserve that much. I am going to die. I am going to die as a man, as a human being. It has taken so much away from me. So very much, but I will not let it have this. If you have found this journal, if you are hearing this, then you have to get out. Leave now, before it knows that you are here, before it traps you in here like me. I can only hope that I will jump from here into oblivion, and that there is nothing waiting for me on the other side. It was for our own protection. That's what our father said as he meticulously checked each of the 7 locks on the door. Penelope and I watched him cautiously from the dark of the living room. His hands fidgeted with the knobs, toggled the deadbolts, traced the square edges of the new padlock that had been installed, with what was almost mistakable as gentleness. The dreary light of sunset filtered through the windows, catching dust motes and lighting them up with a ghostly incandescence before they stirred and settled in the gloom along with our father, his shirt damp and stained, his hair disheveled, his eyes rheumy with a pessimistic, sleepless sort of worry. For weeks he had been telling us that Halloween was cancelled for us, that this year we'd be keeping all the lights off, the doors locked, and the shades down. He'd said it with a sort of nervous electricity each time, the kind we'd seen over and over again as we'd grown up, the kind our mother had warned us about through her teeth when she'd finally left him. If his words hadn't convinced us to listen, the way he made himself tall and broad like a wall when he said it had. There would be no disobeying him on this. The locks, it seemed, were to make sure of that. Still, we could see the other children, costumed and wandering along the street. I felt Penelope tense as she looked on and squeezed her hand. Then, absently, I scratched the side of my head.
I don't understand why we can't go out for a little bit. Just a little bit. We could stay right out front, right where you could see us. If anything bad happened, we could come right back.
Penelope said, her voice high and brittle like a bell in the silence. Though she was speaking to him, she didn't turn her head away from the window. Outside, a lanky boy with a jack-o'-lantern for a head and skeleton suit for a body stopped at the edge of the driveway, stared up at the house, and then shuffled on.
My decision is final,
my father replied, his voice phlegmy but empathetic nonetheless.
We're all staying in tonight. Lights off, door locked, windows shaded like we'd said. I need to keep you here to keep you safe, especially with that shit your mother has been pulling lately.
Penelope and I hadn't needed to be told that she was the reason for his worry. In the last week alone, she'd driven by 6 times and parked her car at the end of the driveway twice without getting out. The one time she did get out, she'd walked the entire length of the driveway, casting furtive glances over her shoulder and eyeing the house teary-eyed. We could tell by the way her black sedan skewed in the gravel and the look in her eyes that she'd been drinking again. It was a surprise that Russell, her long-term boyfriend, or his son, Dane, weren't with her. When the front door hadn't budged, she trudged through the overgrowth along the side of the house to the back. Our father hadn't known that she'd still had a key, but the noise she'd made trying to come through the front had been enough to tip him off that she was around again. When she'd finally managed to put the key in the back door's lock and turn it, our father was there to meet her. Without a word, he'd slammed the door back in her face, sending her scrambling and screaming backwards, then running back to her car while nursing her bloody nose. Now, the back door was tacked permanently shut with 3 heavy 2x4s. It's only a matter of time before your mother, or someone caught in her clutches, comes back to the house again. She's the one that decided she didn't want to be a part of this family anymore, who decided that her new life with Russell was more important than us. Neither she nor anyone who shows up on her behalf are coming in to talk to you or your sister. The fact that today of all days, they could show up on our doorstep with masks on to hide their judgmental faces and lying mouths should be enough for you to just trust me and do as I say. Penelope put her hands to the side of her head and sighed. The red light sliced through the shades and cast her face with a hellish glow, pooling with her damp hair pushed up between her fingers. Across the street, a group of miniature princesses shrieked as a spidery, mechanical scarecrow came to life while they reached for the cauldron heaped with candy at the base of its feet. As night fell over our neighborhood, Penelope and I watched the ebb and flow of trick-or-treaters on the street. With the no-lights rule our father was enforcing, that meant no television, no computers, no nothing. He'd briefly suggested that we go upstairs to read, or maybe even that we call it an early night. But the selfsame magic that captivated us as we watched the costume figures flit from door to door like buzzing, brightly colored flies refused to let us grow tired. Here was a group of boys dressed as pirates, some with red and black bandanas strung like garland around their wiry frames, others with austere tricorn hats catching the streetlights with their blade-like edges. There was a group of older girls, high schoolers like us, their heels ruby red in the cold white of their ankles as their makeshift covens strode confidently and undoubtedly towards some Halloween party or another. And with each passing car, I wondered slightly if our mother would return tonight. if she would fulfill my father's prophecy and try to steal us away. But the cars never entered our driveway, never even slowed as they passed, and Penelope was silent, though I knew her eyes were following the same crowds and cars as mine were. Our father was nowhere to be seen. As midnight approached, the stream of costumed visitors to our neighborhood had slowed to a trickle. I could see that the slowing festivities had changed Penelope, that the fewer people there were on the street, the more concrete the fact that we'd missed Halloween became for her. With her penchant for bright colors, ghost stories, and her insatiable sweet tooth, it had always been her favorite holiday. Missing it was a huge letdown, but watching it pass had been even worse. I put my hands on hers again and squeezed lightly. "It'll be okay, Penelope. There's always next year." Penelope scoffed.
I hate when you say that it will be okay. Whenever you say that, it never is.
She bit her bottom lip and then sighed.
And how do you even know that next year will be any different? Dad has always been this way. Will always be this way. Afraid of this or that. Pissed at Mom or whoever he thinks she's trying to reach out to us through. He'll throw more fits, slam more cupboards, scream at us more. He'll always be there to stop us from just moving on. Or having fun. It's not fair.
I slung my arm around her and pulled her closer. You're right. It's not fair, but hopefully we won't have to deal with it much longer. Besides, he is just trying to protect us. As messed up as his idea of protection might be, he means well enough, even if he is a little demanding. Penelope shrugged.
If you say so, I think I'm done here. I'm going to head upstairs.
I sighed. Okay, I'll follow your lead. We stood up from the couch, and for a moment, I felt spacey and unsteady, as if I were floating far away from my body. But just as I was going to reach out for Penelope to steady myself, we heard the gravel of the driveway crunch, and a white light blasted through the shades and illuminated the entire living room. Immediately, we were back at the window. The bloom of the light was blinding, especially after spending the entire day shrouded in the indoor darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see the dark stretch of our mother's black sedan. The doors swung open, the headlights went black, and the doors closed. 4 figures, varying in height and width, stood silhouetted against the streetlights.
Dad!
Penelope yelled.
Dad, someone's here!
Slowly and purposefully, they advanced towards the house. As they approached, we could see that each held something. One a crowbar, another a pair of bolt cutters, the third a baseball bat. They climbed the porch stairs, the wood groaning beneath their collective weight. Penelope and I had both instinctively stopped panting, our breaths growing shallow and harsh. We could hear them talking through the wall.
"Are you sure this is the place?" "I'm positive."
A familiar voice answered.
"This is where she said it was. I've been by it before." "And you're sure that we can have our fun here without someone finding out? You're sure that there won't be any problems?" "I doubt it,"
said the familiar voice.
"And if there is, there's 4 of us at least."
The first voice laughed in response.
"Good. Then what are you waiting for? You turn on the lights so we can make this quick."
There was a small click, and the yellow beam of a boxy flashlight flared to life. Through the slats in the shades, we could see them now. High school boys, all of them. One of them was tall, with long, greasy, dark hair. Another stood above the rest, his hair lighter and curled, his face pockmarked by acne and scars. A third stood behind them, a ball cap on his head, his hands wrapped around the grip of the baseball bat on his shoulder as if it were a claymore. The last, the one with the flashlight, we recognized, first by the skeleton suit he was wearing, and then by his sunken eyes and pinched nose. It was Dane.
"Come with me, now!"
Our father materialized from the darkness, and I almost screamed. Penelope leapt up from the couch, taking his hand, and I followed. As we heard the metal edge of the crowbar jam between the door and its frame, our father pushed us down the hall toward the kitchen. We passed the back door and stopped at the entrance to the basement.
"Listen, don't go down into the basement. Stay at the top of these stairs, and no matter what you hear, don't come out. You hear me?"
The door swung open, and we stepped inside.
"I don't know what these boys are up to, but your mother must have sent them, and she's not getting her grimy fucking hands on my kids."
The door slammed, and darkness enveloped us. I could feel Penelope shivering next to me as our father locked the door from the other side and walked away. The side of my head began to itch and I scratched it, anxiously pulling at the roots of my hair. We heard the wood of the front door groan and creak. Seconds later, we heard it slam back into its frame. There was silence, and then something smashed into a window pane, shattering it into our home. One thump followed, then another, and a third, and a fourth. Footsteps on the wood, and the floorboards protesting. Penelope's breath was loud in my ear, her body quaking, her nails digging into my skin. The silence above seemed to stretch on without end, and I wondered where our father was, what his plan was. I wondered if he could stop them. Then, the linoleum outside of the basement door creaked, and I pulled Penelope close and covered her mouth. The lock slid on the other side, and the knob turned. The door swung open, and the 4 boys stood, staring at us with half grins on their faces. Their grips on their tools tightened. The beam of the box flashlight swung up from the floor until it laid directly on Penelope and me. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my chest heaving as I tried to breathe. My brain was telling me to scream, to cast Penelope down the stairs and throw myself at them, but instead I just stared back at them, the light of the flashlight on my face, my body anticipating what came next.
"Here we are,"
said Dane with a chuckle.
"Just what we're looking for."
He took a step toward us, closing the space.
"We're going to do it down there?"
The greasy-haired boy asked, following close behind.
"Where else?"
Dane laughed.
"This is where it has to happen."
He took another step, and then another, until we were eye to eye, our faces almost touching. I could smell a faint hint of chocolate on his breath. I could feel the heat radiating from his body.
"We're right behind you,"
one of the other boys said. And starting with Dane, one by one, the boys walked through us into the basement, as if we were no more than a projection, a mist, a mirage. They passed through us, and I felt the walls around me begin to warp and stretch.